I went on a first date with a guy who suggested coffee because it was low pressure. When I arrived, he was already seated with his laptop open and headphones on. He told me he just needed to finish an email and asked me to wait a minute. That minute turned into 20. When he finally closed the laptop, he smiled and said, "Thanks for understanding. Most people aren't this chill." I hadn't even ordered yet. My date showed up late and immediately started explaining traffic. Not normal traffic, every car that personally wronged him on the way there. By the time our food arrived, I knew which driver cut him off, which one didn't signal, and which one shouldn't be allowed to drive. He paused, looked at me, and said, "Sorry, I just needed to vent." Then he checked his phone and sighed again. I met a guy for dinner who spent the entire time talking about his workout routine. Calories, supplements, rest days, nothing was skipped. When my food arrived, he looked at my plate and nodded seriously. "That's fine for a cheat meal," he said. I told him it wasn't a cheat meal. He replied, "It is now," and went back to explaining protein ratios. He paid the bill like he deserved credit for it. My date insisted on choosing the restaurant because he said he was a foodie. When we sat down, he asked the waiter what the safest option was. Then he asked which dish people complain about the least. After ordering, he leaned toward me and said, "I don't like surprises." When the food came, he tasted it carefully and said, "Yeah, this is exactly what I expected." He looked very relieved. I went on a first date with someone who brought up marriage within 10 minutes. Not in a romantic way, more like a planning meeting. He asked how I felt about joint bank accounts and where I'd want to live long term. When I laughed, he frowned and said, "I'm serious. I don't want to waste time." He then checked his watch and said, "Okay, we still have 30 minutes to see if this works." My date arrived wearing sunglasses indoors. When I asked why, he said he didn't like people seeing his eyes until he trusted them. He never took them off. Not while ordering. Not while eating. Not while laughing at his own jokes. At one point, the waiter asked if he wanted dessert. He turned his entire head toward me and said, "I'll let her decide." I declined for both of us. I met someone for drinks who kept checking his phone face down on the table. Every time it buzzed, he smiled slightly. Finally, he admitted his ex was texting him. He said it casually, like it was weather. "She just wants to know if I'm happy," he explained. When I asked why he was responding, he said, "I want to be respectful." He typed a long reply and asked if it sounded mature. My date spent most of the evening telling me how honest he was. He repeated it often, like a reminder. Then he admitted he had lied about his age, just a little on his profile. When I asked how much, he said, "Enough to get more matches." He laughed and added, "See? Honesty." He seemed proud of himself for confessing before dessert arrived. I went on a dinner date where the guy kept rating things out loud. The chairs, the lighting, the menu, my drink. At one point, he looked at me thoughtfully and said, "I'd give this date a solid 7 so far." I asked, what would make it an 8? He said, "Less awkward silence." Then he went quiet and waited for me to fix it. Near the end of my first date, my phone rang and I ignored it. My date nodded approvingly and said, "Good, I like that you're present." Then his phone rang. He answered immediately and turned away from the table. When he came back, he apologized and said it was important. I asked what it was. He smiled and said, "My mom just wanted to check in." He ordered another drink to celebrate honesty. I went on a first date with someone who kept correcting my pronunciation. Not big words, normal ones. Every time I spoke, he nodded and gently repeated the sentence the right way. When I finally asked if it bothered him, he smiled and said, "I just value clear communication." Later, he mispronounced the name of the restaurant we were in. I corrected him once. He stopped smiling after that. My date spent the entire evening explaining how dating apps were beneath him. He said he only used them because Modern dating is broken. I asked why he matched with me then. He said, "You seemed low risk." When the check came, he looked relieved and said, "Well, this confirmed a lot for me." He didn't explain what it confirmed, and I didn't ask. I met someone for dinner who kept mentioning how expensive everything was. The drinks, the appetizers, the chairs. When the food arrived, he stared at the plate and said, "For this price, it should be life-changing." He took one bite and sighed. At the end, he suggested splitting the bill evenly because we both learned something tonight. I'm still not sure what that lesson was. My date arrived carrying a notebook. I thought it was for work, but halfway through the meal, he opened it. Inside were handwritten questions. He explained he liked to stay organized. He checked them off as I answered. When I asked what happened if I failed one, he laughed and said, "Oh, we wouldn't be here this long." He closed the notebook carefully and asked for dessert. I went on a first date with someone who kept reminding me he was very chill. He said it before ordering, after ordering, and again while eating. When the waiter got his order wrong, he went completely silent. Then he calmly asked for the manager. Afterward, he turned back to me and said, "See, still chill." He waited for my agreement. I nodded because it felt safer. My date insisted on telling me how different he was from other people. He said he didn't follow trends, didn't care about opinions, and hated labels. Then he spent 10 minutes explaining his personality type. He asked mine and frowned when I didn't know it. "That's important," he said. Later, he described the date as refreshingly predictable. I wasn't sure which part he meant. I met someone who spent the entire date talking about future plans. Not ours, his. Career moves, city changes, lifestyle upgrades. I nodded along until he asked where I fit into all of it. Before I could answer, he said, "Actually, don't answer yet. Let's see how tonight goes." He looked very proud of the process. My date kept laughing before finishing his sentences. Every story ended with him saying, "You probably won't get it." Eventually, I stopped asking questions. He noticed and said, "I like that you're mysterious." When I asked him something personal, he laughed again and said, "Yeah, you wouldn't get it." We finished our drinks in comfortable confusion. I went on a first date with someone who kept comparing me to his friends. He said things like, "You're quieter than Sarah and out. You'd get along with Mike." At one point, he said, "They'd really like you." I asked if he did. He paused and said, "Well, that's what this is for." He seemed satisfied with that answer. Near the end of my first date, my date asked how I thought it was going. I said it was nice. He nodded and said, "Yeah, I'd call it a solid practice round." When I asked what he meant, he explained he didn't expect every date to be serious. This was more about getting back out there, he said. He thanked me for helping and suggested we both keep trying. I went on a first date with a guy who kept asking if I was having fun yet. He asked it after ordering, after the food arrived, and again while I was chewing. Each time, he nodded seriously at my answer. Near the end, he said, "I just like to check in." Then he rated the date out loud and said, "So far, you seem comfortable." I wasn't sure if that was feedback or a goal. My date spent the entire dinner telling me how honest he was. He said lying was his biggest red flag. Then he casually mentioned he had used photos from 5 years ago on his profile. When I pointed that out, he shrugged and said, "Technically, that was still me." He smiled like he'd won an argument. Afterward, he said he appreciated how open we were being with each other. I met someone for coffee who kept glancing at the door every few minutes. When I asked if he was expecting someone, he said no. Later, he admitted he was waiting to see if his ex walked in. "She comes here sometimes," he explained. When I asked why that mattered, he said, "I just want her to see me doing well." He straightened his posture and smiled at the door again. My date insisted on walking me to my car even though it was parked nearby. On the way, he started explaining how protective he was. He listed situations where he would step in. When we reached my car, he asked if I felt safe. I said yes. He nodded proudly and said, "Good. That's my role." He waited for a thank you before saying goodbye. I went on a first date with someone who kept correcting the waiter. Not about mistakes, about preferences. He explained how dishes were supposed to be made. When the waiter left, he turned to me and said, "I just know what I like." Later, when my food arrived wrong, he told me not to say anything. "Conflict ruins the vibe," he explained calmly. My date talked a lot about how independent he was. He said he didn't rely on anyone and valued freedom. Halfway through the date, his phone rang. He answered immediately and said, "Hey Mom, I'm at dinner." He spent 5 minutes discussing what he'd eat tomorrow. When he hung up, he looked at me and said, "Family is different." I nodded and waited for the independence to return. I met someone who said silence made him uncomfortable, so he filled every pause with commentary. He narrated the menu, the lighting, and the music. When I stopped responding, he said, "You're really making me carry this conversation." I apologized, out of habit. He smiled and said, "Good communication is important." Then he continued talking until the check arrived. My date spent most of the evening talking about his future house. Not where it would be, how it would look, room by room. When I asked where I fit into it, he paused and said, "Well, this is more of a solo vision right now." He went back to describing the kitchen. He said it would be perfect for hosting. I wondered who the guests were. I went on a first date with someone who kept testing my reactions. He'd say something strange and then watch my face carefully. When I asked what he was doing, he said, "I'm just seeing how flexible you are." Later, he admitted he liked people who could handle surprises. He nodded approvingly at my silence. At the end, he said, "You passed more than I expected." I didn't ask what the test was. Near the end of the date, my date asked if I believed in chemistry. I said yes. He nodded thoughtfully and said, "I think chemistry can grow." Then he added, "Or it can just not be there." He smiled politely and finished his drink. When we stood up, he thanked me for meeting him and said, "This was a good experience." He said it like feedback, not a goodbye.